Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of Caesar's civil war, 49-45 BCE. Now buckle up as we begin. By 50 BCE, tensions in Rome had reached a breaking point. Julius Caesar had spent 8 years conquering Gaul, amassing wealth, glory, and the fierce loyalty of his legions. Meanwhile, in Rome, his former ally Pompey the Great had grown jealous and fearful of Caesar's rising power. The first triumvirate, the secret alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus that had dominated Roman politics, lay in ruins. Crassus was dead, killed fighting the Parthians at Carrhae, and without his mediating influence, Caesar and Pompey became bitter rivals. The Roman Senate, led by Caesar's enemy Cato the Younger, demanded that Caesar disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for his actions in Gaul. Caesar knew this would mean his political death and likely exile or worse. As 49 BCE began, Caesar faced an impossible choice. The Senate's ultimatum was clear: dismiss his legions and return to Rome defenseless, or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar's supporters, including the tribune Mark Antony, fled Rome when they were threatened with violence for defending Caesar's interests. This gave Caesar the pretext he needed. On January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar stood with a single legion, the 13th, at the banks of the Rubicon River in northern Italy. This small stream marked the boundary between Gaul and Roman territory. By law, no general could bring an army across this river toward Rome without Senate permission. To cross meant civil war, the end of the Republic as it existed, and either triumph or death for Caesar. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar paused at the riverbank, knowing the magnitude of his decision. Then, reportedly quoting a line from the Greek playwright Menander, he declared, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, and led his army across the Rubicon into history. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. His swift advance southward caught his enemies completely off guard. Rather than the massive invasion force they had expected, Caesar had crossed with just one legion, gambling everything on speed and the element of surprise. As news of his approach spread, panic gripped Rome. The Senate had prepared for a long mobilization, expecting months to gather their forces. Instead, Caesar's veterans were already marching down the Italian peninsula. Town after town opened their gates to Caesar without resistance. His clemency toward defeated enemies, a policy he would maintain throughout the Civil War, won him support among those who feared the brutal proscriptions that had marked previous civil conflicts. Many Romans remembered the horrors of Marius and Sulla's wars and welcomed Caesar's more merciful approach. Meanwhile, Pompey found himself in an impossible position. His legions were scattered across the empire, and he had badly underestimated both Caesar's audacity and the speed with which events would unfold. The great general who had once been called Magnus the Great was about to face the greatest challenge of his career. Pompey made a fateful strategic decision that would define the entire war. Rather than make a stand in Italy, he chose to abandon Rome itself and retreat across the Adriatic to Greece, where he could gather the vast resources of the eastern provinces. This plan, while strategically sound in the long term, was a public relations disaster. To many Romans, Pompey appeared to be fleeing in cowardice from his former protege. Caesar, meanwhile, continued his lightning advance. Within 60 days of crossing the Rubicon, he had conquered all of Italy with minimal bloodshed. His policy of clementia, showing mercy to his defeated enemies, proved brilliantly effective. Rather than executing or proscribing his opponents, Caesar pardoned them and often allowed them to keep their positions. This clemency stood in stark contrast to the brutal civil wars of the previous generation. However, Caesar faced a critical problem. He lacked a fleet to pursue Pompey across the Adriatic. Instead, he made another bold decision. He would first secure his position by conquering Pompey's supporters in Spain, famously declaring he would go to fight an army without a leader, then return to fight a leader without an army. This quip perfectly captured Caesar's confidence and tactical brilliance. While Pompey regrouped in Greece, Caesar turned his attention to securing his position. First, he marched on Rome itself, which he entered without violence in April 49 BCE. The city that had been abandoned by its defenders welcomed Caesar, though many senators had fled with Pompey. Caesar's first acts showed his political acumen. He opened the treasury to fund his campaign, but did so legally, appointing himself dictator just long enough to conduct elections and secure his position. He then resigned the dictatorship and had himself elected consul, giving his actions a veneer of constitutional legitimacy. However, Caesar's most pressing concern was not political but military. Pompey's forces in Spain, led by his lieutenants Afranius and Petreius, posed a serious threat to Caesar's rear. These were experienced troops who had served under Pompey for years. Additionally, they controlled the vast wealth and resources of the Spanish provinces. Caesar could not afford to leave this army intact while he pursued Pompey eastward. The Spanish campaign would test Caesar's generalship against seasoned opponents on difficult terrain, far from the familiar battlefields of Gaul, where he had won his greatest victories. The Spanish campaign of 49 BCE showcased Caesar's tactical genius against experienced opponents. Pompey's lieutenants, Afranius and Petreius, commanded 5 veteran legions and had chosen their position well near the town of Islada in northeastern Spain. They controlled the high ground and had secured the local river crossings, forcing Caesar into a difficult position. Initial skirmishes went poorly for Caesar as spring floods made maneuvering nearly impossible. His supply lines were threatened, and for the first time since crossing the Rubicon, Caesar faced the possibility of a serious defeat. However, as the floods receded, Caesar demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had conquered Gaul. Through a series of complex maneuvers, he managed to cut off the Pompeian forces from their water supply, while simultaneously threatening their communications with the rest of Spain. Afranius and Petreius found themselves trapped in an increasingly hopeless position. True to his policy of clemency, Caesar offered generous terms to his enemies. When the Pompeian forces finally surrendered, Caesar disbanded their legions but allowed the officers to depart unharmed. Many of their soldiers, impressed by Caesar's generosity and leadership, chose to join his army. The Spanish campaign was won through superior strategy rather than a costly battle. With Spain secured, Caesar faced his greatest challenge yet, pursuing Pompey across the Adriatic Sea. During Caesar's absence, Pompey had not been idle. He had assembled a formidable coalition of Roman nobles, foreign kings, and provincial governors. His forces included not only Roman legions, but also troops from across the eastern Mediterranean. Gallic cavalry, Germanic warriors, Syrian archers, and ships from every allied city. Most importantly, Pompey controlled the sea, making any crossing to Greece extremely dangerous for Caesar. In late 49 BCE, Caesar assembled his forces at Brundisium on Italy's Adriatic coast. He faced a logistical nightmare, transporting 7 legions across hostile waters patrolled by Pompey's superior fleet. Caesar's solution was characteristically bold and risky. Rather than wait for favorable conditions, he would cross in winter when Pompey least expected it, using every available ship in multiple dangerous voyages. On January 4th, 48 BCE, Caesar loaded his first wave of troops onto a makeshift fleet of commandeered vessels. The crossing was treacherous, with winter storms and enemy patrols threatening disaster at every moment. Only about half of his army made it across in the first crossing, leaving Caesar dangerously outnumbered on the Greek coast with Pompey's massive army approaching. Caesar's precarious position in Greece nearly ended his campaign before it truly began. Stranded on the coast near Dyrrhachium with only part of his army, he faced Pompey's much larger force, while his remaining legions were trapped on the Italian side of the Adriatic. According to legend, Caesar was so frustrated by the delay that he attempted to cross back to Italy himself in a small boat to hurry his remaining troops, reportedly telling the frightened captain, "Fear nothing, you carry Caesar and his fortune." The storm turned them back, but Caesar's remaining forces finally managed the crossing in March 48 BCE, reuniting his army just in time. The subsequent campaign around Dyrrhachium proved to be one of Caesar's few setbacks. Pompey, fighting on ground of his choosing with superior numbers, managed to break Caesar's siege lines and inflict a rare defeat on his enemy. Caesar's losses were significant, and for a moment it appeared that Pompey might end the war in a single decisive battle. However, Pompey's cautious nature proved to be his undoing. Rather than pursuing Caesar's retreating army and destroying it completely, Pompey hesitated, allowing Caesar to escape with most of his forces intact. This hesitation would prove to be a fatal mistake, giving Caesar time to recover and choose the ground for their next encounter. After his setback at Dyrrhachium, Caesar made a strategic withdrawal into Thessaly, seeking more favorable ground for the decisive battle he knew must come. Pompey followed, confident that his victory at Dyrrhachium had crippled his opponent. The two armies converged near the town of Pharsalus in August 48 BCE. Caesar's position seemed desperate. He commanded only about 22,000 men against Pompey's 45,000. Moreover, Pompey's army included the best of Rome's nobility and experienced troops from across the empire. Yet Caesar possessed advantages that numbers could not measure. His soldiers were veterans of the Gallic Wars, absolutely devoted to their commander, while many of Pompey's troops were recent recruits or foreign auxiliaries of questionable loyalty. As the armies drew up for battle on the plain of Pharsalus, the fate of Rome hung in the balance. Pompey deployed his forces in traditional fashion, placing his best troops on the wings and relying on his superior cavalry to outflank Caesar's smaller army. Caesar, however, had prepared a surprise. Recognizing that his weaker cavalry could not match Pompey's, he had secretly positioned a fourth line of his finest veterans behind his right wing, armed with javelins and specifically trained to counter cavalry attacks. The Battle of Pharsalus began at dawn on August 9, 48 BCE. Pompey's plan was sound in theory. His superior cavalry would sweep around Caesar's right flank, while his infantry pinned Caesar's forces in place. Initially, the battle proceeded according to Pompey's expectations. His cavalry, supported by archers and slingers, drove back Caesar's outnumbered horsemen and began to outflank the Caesarian line. Victory seemed within Pompey's grasp, but Caesar had anticipated this moment. At the critical instant, he unleashed his secret fourth line. These veteran legionaries, armed with javelins, charged into Pompey's cavalry with devastating effect. The young Roman nobles, who made up much of Pompey's mounted force, more concerned with preserving their good looks than dying for the Republic, broke and fled, rather than face the sharp points of Caesar's javelins thrust at their faces. With Pompey's cavalry routed, Caesar's own horsemen rallied and attacked the exposed flank of Pompey's infantry. Simultaneously, Caesar's fourth line wheeled around to strike the Pompeian army in the rear. Caught in a pincer movement, Pompey's forces began to collapse. The great general himself, seeing his carefully laid plans crumbling, reportedly exclaimed, "Even in our camp," and fled the battlefield, his dreams of victory shattered in a matter of hours. The aftermath of Pharsalus was swift and decisive. Pompey's great army, the pride of the Roman establishment, disintegrated in hours. Over 15,000 Pompeians lay dead on the field, while Caesar lost fewer than 1,000 men. The survivors fled in all directions, some to Africa, others to Spain, and many simply returned home, their taste for civil war extinguished by the crushing defeat. Pompey himself escaped with a small group of supporters, but his power was broken forever. Caesar's victory was complete, but he showed his characteristic clemency even in triumph. Unlike the brutal proscriptions of earlier civil wars, Caesar pardoned his enemies and welcomed them back into the fold. However, one crucial figure had escaped: Pompey Magnus himself. The former triumvir had fled toward Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, whom Pompey had helped place on the throne years earlier. Caesar, despite his exhaustion from the campaign, knew that he could not allow his greatest enemy to regroup and potentially start the war anew. With a small force, Caesar set sail for Egypt in pursuit, unaware that he was sailing toward one of the most dangerous episodes of his entire career. Egypt's political situation was volatile, with the boy king Ptolemy XIII locked in civil war with his sister wife Cleopatra VII. Pompey's flight to Egypt ended in tragedy and treachery that would shock the Roman world. When the defeated general arrived at Alexandria with his small retinue, the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII faced a terrible dilemma. Harboring Pompey might provoke Caesar's wrath, but turning him away might anger other Romans. Ptolemy's advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the Roman exile Achilles, made a coldly pragmatic decision. They would eliminate the problem by murdering Pompey and presenting his head to Caesar as a gift. On September 28, 48 BCE, Pompey was invited aboard a small boat supposedly to be escorted to shore with honor. Instead, as his wife Cornelia watched in horror from their ship, Pompey was stabbed to death by men he had once considered allies. His head was severed and his body thrown into the sea, ending the life of one of Rome's greatest generals in the most ignoble fashion possible. 3 days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with Pompey's head and signet ring. Contrary to Ptolemy's expectations, Caesar was horrified rather than pleased. Some sources claim he wept at the sight, whether from genuine sorrow for his former ally or anger at being denied the chance to show his famous clemency. The murder of Pompey would ultimately prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation by the young Egyptian king. Caesar's arrival in Egypt plunged him into a dangerous game of palace intrigue that nearly cost him his life. With only a small force of about 4,000 men, Caesar found himself in the middle of a vicious civil war between the young Ptolemy XIII and his older sister, Cleopatra VII. The Egyptian court, led by the eunuch Pothinus, initially tried to manipulate Caesar, believing they could control the Roman conqueror. They were gravely mistaken. Caesar, though outnumbered, was still the master of Rome and not to be trifled with. When Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet, she found in the 52-year-old Roman a man still susceptible to both political alliance and personal attraction. The brilliant young queen, fluent in multiple languages and highly educated, quickly became both Caesar's lover and political ally. This liaison enraged Ptolemy's faction, who began plotting against Caesar's life. What followed was the Alexandrine War, a conflict that saw Caesar besieged in the palace quarter of Alexandria for months. Cut off from reinforcements and surrounded by hostile forces, Caesar faced some of the darkest days of his career. The great library of Alexandria was reportedly damaged during the fighting, though the extent of the destruction remains debated by historians. The Alexandrine War tested Caesar's tactical genius in an entirely new environment. Trapped in the palace quarter with a small force, Caesar had to defend against Egyptian armies while simultaneously conducting naval battles in Alexandria's harbor. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, with narrow streets and ancient buildings providing cover for Egyptian insurgents. Caesar's most desperate moment came when he was nearly captured during a naval engagement and had to swim to safety, reportedly holding important documents above water with one hand while swimming with the other. His famous commentaries were nearly lost to the Mediterranean Sea. The tide turned when reinforcements finally arrived from Asia Minor under Mithridates of Pergamon, along with Jewish auxiliaries led by Antipater. The combined Roman allied force met Ptolemy XIII's army at the Battle of the Nile in 47 BCE. The young pharaoh's forces were decisively defeated, and Ptolemy himself drowned while fleeing across the Nile. Whether by accident or design remains unknown. With her brother rival dead, Cleopatra became the undisputed ruler of Egypt, though she would share the throne nominally with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, as required by Egyptian custom. Caesar had not only survived his most dangerous predicament, but had also secured Egypt's vast wealth and grain supply for Rome. Caesar's time in Egypt had consumed precious months, and during his absence, his enemies had regrouped. Reports reached Alexandria of new threats emerging across the Roman world. In Asia Minor, Pharnaces II, son of the great Mithridates, had invaded Roman territory, hoping to exploit Caesar's preoccupation with Egyptian affairs. Meanwhile, in Africa, the surviving Pompeians had gathered under Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio, rebuilding their forces with the help of King Juba of Numidia. Spain, too, was showing signs of renewed resistance. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra had produced a son, Caesarion, but duty called the Roman general away from domestic bliss. In the spring of 47 BCE, Caesar finally departed Egypt, leaving Cleopatra secure on her throne and taking with him the resources needed to continue his campaigns. His first destination was Asia Minor, where Pharnaces had proven unexpectedly successful against Roman forces. The Pontic king had won several victories and was threatening to undo decades of Roman conquest in the region. Caesar moved with his characteristic speed, determined to deal with this threat quickly before turning his attention to the more dangerous Pompeian revival in Africa. The stage was set for another demonstration of Caesar's military genius. The campaign against Pharnaces in Asia Minor became famous for its brevity and decisiveness. Caesar arrived to find that the Pontic king had grown overconfident, believing that his recent victories had proven Roman weakness. Pharnaces controlled strong positions in the mountainous terrain near Zela, the same location where his father Mithridates had once defeated a Roman army. History seemed to favor the son repeating the father's success. However, Pharnaces had never faced an opponent like Caesar. On August 2nd, 47 BCE, Caesar launched an immediate attack despite his troops' exhaustion from their rapid march. The Battle of Zela lasted only 4 hours, but was so complete a victory that Caesar would later commemorate it with his famous dispatch to Rome. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Pharnaces' army was completely destroyed, and the king himself barely escaped with his life, only to be killed later by his own former subjects. Caesar's lightning campaign had lasted only 5 days from arrival to victory, demonstrating that his tactical brilliance remained undiminished despite the trials in Egypt. With Asia Minor secured, Caesar could now turn his attention to the far more serious threat posed by the Pompeian revival in Africa, where his most dangerous enemies awaited. While Caesar had been occupied in Egypt and Asia Minor, the most formidable of his remaining enemies had gathered in North Africa. Cato the Younger, Caesar's most principled opponent and a champion of the old republic, had joined forces with Metellus Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, and King Juba I of Numidia. Together, they commanded a substantial army that included not only Roman legions, but also Numidian cavalry and war elephants. This coalition represented the last hope of the Republican cause. Caesar arrived in Africa in late 47 BCE, but faced immediate difficulties. His initial landing was contested, and several of his ships were lost to enemy action. The African terrain favored the Numidians, whose light cavalry could harass Caesar's heavier Roman forces while avoiding decisive engagement. For months, Caesar found himself frustrated by an enemy that refused to fight on his terms. His supply situation was precarious, and for the first time since crossing the Rubicon, some of his veterans began to question whether their commander's luck had finally run out. However, Caesar's persistence eventually paid off. Through a series of maneuvers, he managed to separate his enemies and force them to accept battle on ground more favorable to his legions. The decisive encounter would come at Thapsus in 46 BCE. The Battle of Thapsus in 46 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the Republican cause. Caesar finally managed to bring his enemies to decisive battle when they moved to relieve the besieged city of Thapsus. The Republican forces, commanded by Metellus Scipio, deployed their army in traditional fashion, but made the crucial mistake of placing their war elephants in the front line. Caesar, who had encountered elephants during his brief time in Britain and had studied accounts of previous Roman encounters with these beasts, prepared his troops carefully. He positioned his veteran 5th Legion, experienced in dealing with unusual enemies, opposite the elephants and equipped his men with special anti-elephant tactics. When battle was joined, the elephants initially caused panic in Caesar's ranks, but the disciplined Roman response soon turned the tide. The elephants, wounded by javelins and unnerved by the steady Roman advance, turned and stampeded back through their own lines, causing chaos in the Republican ranks. Caesar's cavalry, meanwhile, had routed the Numidian horse, leaving Scipio's infantry exposed on both flanks. The Republican army collapsed in complete defeat. Scipio himself fell in the battle, while King Juba retreated to his capital, knowing that his kingdom was lost. Only Cato remained as a symbol of republican resistance. The aftermath of Thapsus saw the final collapse of organized republican resistance. King Juba, knowing his cause was lost, chose to die by his own hand rather than face capture by Caesar. Most significantly, Cato the Younger, Caesar's most implacable philosophical opponent, took his own life in the city of Utica rather than accept Caesar's clemency. Cato's suicide was intended as a final moral victory over Caesar, denying him the chance to demonstrate mercy to his greatest critic. The death of Cato the Younger sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and would inspire republican sentiment for generations to come. However, Caesar's victory in Africa was not yet complete. Two of Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had escaped to Spain, where they were raising yet another army from the remnants of their father's supporters and loyal Spanish tribes. Though exhausted by years of continuous campaigning, Caesar knew he could not rest while any organized opposition remained. In 45 BCE, he launched what he hoped would be his final campaign, marching into Spain to face Pompey's sons at Munda. This battle would prove to be Caesar's hardest-fought victory, pushing even his veteran legions to their limits and nearly resulting in his defeat. The civil war that had begun with such promise at the Rubicon was ending in bitter, grinding combat between fellow Romans. The Battle of Munda in 45 BCE was Caesar's final and most difficult victory. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had assembled a formidable army in southern Spain, and the terrain favored the defenders. For the first time in his career, Caesar's legendary confidence seemed to waver. The battle was so hard-fought that Caesar himself had to dismount and personally rally his wavering legions, grabbing a shield and fighting in the front ranks like a common soldier. His veterans, inspired by their commander's personal courage, finally managed to break the Pompeian resistance, but at terrible cost. The civil war was finally over, but it had consumed the Roman Republic itself. Caesar returned to Rome as its undisputed master, celebrating 4 triumphs and being appointed dictator for life. However, his victory had come at an enormous price. The Republic's institutions lay in ruins, tens of thousands of Romans were dead, and the very concept of representative government had been shattered. Caesar's clemency and political reforms could not erase the fundamental change he had brought to Rome. Within a year, he would be dead, assassinated by senators who hoped to restore the Republic, setting off yet another round of civil wars that would ultimately bring Augustus to power and establish the Roman Empire. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.